Hey guys, we are back doing another season power ranking for Survivor Edge of Extinction, where I'll be doing my episode by episode edgic analysis for the season. And I'm going to be straight up, this is probably one of the hardest seasons that I could do this exercise for, considering this season is very much an outlier for obvious reasons, not only from a gameplay perspective, but also from an edgic perspective. I remember at the time watching the season live and just being very confused over where the season was going, as I never really felt like the season followed the normal trends that you would see with edgic. And I feel like a lot of the top contenders you saw early on would just die off, and people would just pop in and out of the season as it went along, not to mention how fluid the actual gameplay was. And the season was very difficult to predict from an edgic perspective. Now, looking back in hindsight, it does make a bit more sense considering the outcome, but also the fact that production said themselves that they wanted to portray this season as a mystery novel where you never really knew where things were going, which led to it being more unpredictable than what you would expect. But even rewatching the season now, it's really hard to track how people are doing episode by episode and who's falling in and out of contention, to where it really feels like this power ranking will be arbitrary, or at least more arbitrary than what it would normally be. But that's just the season that we have to deal with here. But still, it'll be fun to talk about these people's edits as they go along. But there are 18 players to talk about, and that's wasting more time. Let's get into the video. So first up, we have the first boot in Ream Daily. Now, before we continue, I should say that even after people are voted out on this season, I still include them on the power rankings, as they technically still have a shot of coming back into the game, potentially winning. So even though people like Ream were voted out in episode 1, I still kept track of her power rankings the entire season. Now, straight up, I will say that I essentially divided the list into two, where all the people on the edge are kind of like one part of the list below the people within the main game. And straight up, there's never really a point where anyone in the main game is below someone on the edge at any point in the power ranking, as I believe that being in the main game gives you a better shot of winning compared to being on the edge. So I feel like had I been covering the season at the time, that's probably the rule I would have gone with here. And starting off with the Ream, she's your pretty standard first boot here. Never really thought she had much of a chance here. And yes, while she was a big character on the edge for a lot of it, I never really felt like she was primed to really get back into the game. It felt like a lot of her content was her experience on the edge. Like, she was built to be on the edge. And yes, while we got some pretty fun stuff like her fights with Chris, fights with other people, never really saw her coming back into the game. Though, to be fair, she actually did jump up quite a bit by the time of the finale, to where I did think she was one of the more likely returnees, believe it or not, but that was more so because other people on the edge were under-edited. But truth be told, it didn't shock me that she didn't come back, and sure enough, she never really had much of a shot there. Next up, we have Keith, and Keith was also never really a contender, as I felt like his premiere was mostly bad, where even though he gets to prop up his relationship with Ream early on, and we see him practicing swimming, that's immediately undermined, where we see everyone back at camp talking about how he, Ream, and Wendy are this clear trio that needs to be broken up right away. And while he seemed like he could have stayed in episode 2 where Chris was trying to save him, obviously he gets taken out at that point. And straight up, I actually had him below Ream for a decent amount of his time on the edge, as I felt like Ream was getting more solid content compared to him on the edge, as I felt like a lot of him was him struggling and him turning to Ream as like a mother figure. And sure enough, he does end up leaving at the merge after the initial challenge. So again, not too surprising, Keith ends up not winning here by the end of it. Not really a contender in my eyes. Next up, we have Aubrey, and Aubrey was never really a contender either. Now, she wasn't as low on the power ranking compared to Keith and some other people we'll be talking about soon, but I feel like she never really popped off to me. I felt like she mainly got content because she was one of the returnees, and even then, her premiere was mostly quiet, with really the only thing popping out is her quote in the premiere about how she's gonna lay low at first and come out like a cobra, but then it's just immediately out in front right away where people are targeting the vet. Episode 2, she obviously has that really bad scene of her telling people the same thing and how people don't really trust her because of that. And obviously that never really made her look that good at the end of the day. And it's not too surprising she's eventually taken out with an idol and extra vote in her pocket by the end of it. Though again, she's not that low, though I feel like she was mostly just keeping up with the players still in the game. Now, after she gets to the edge, I actually thought she was a pretty interesting prospect, at least initially. She was actually getting a decent amount of content while she was on the edge at first. That made me think she had a shot of being a returnee, though that largely died by the finale, where I felt like other people kind of popped off during that last Edge scene before the finale. So again, never really saw Aubrey as a contender, which makes sense considering how the game plays out. Next up, we have Big Wendy, and obviously Big Wendy was never a contender either. Now, her premiere isn't terrible. She does get a confession on the intro about how she's a super fan. She also ends up telling people about her Tourette's, which becomes a big piece of personal content on the show. But beyond that, she is on the outs on the initial vote, and how she feels the tribe isn't giving Ream enough credit for things, only for Ream to go out. Episode 2, she very quickly becomes like this pariah on her tribe, and really moving forward, her content becomes more over the top, where she becomes focused on the chickens after they win that reward challenge, and her focus on her trying to release the chickens because she doesn't want to kill chickens, even though she eats chicken back home. And the show even highlights this hypocrisy about how she eats chicken at home, but now she is on this moral high ground because she doesn't want to kill the chickens. And again, it's pretty over the top content, pretty clear she's not winning by the end of it. And sure enough, she is voted out right before the merge and leaves not long afterwards. Next up, we have the merge boot in Joe Angam, and Joe was never a contender either. I actually had him at the bottom ranked of the returnees, as he got a pretty bad premiere. He talks in the intro about how strategy is to lay back and not outshine anyone else, only for him to immediately build the entire shelter and to have people like Aurora talking about how amazing he is, literally just going against his own strategy right there. And considering how he is talked about as this big threat right at the bat, it becomes pretty apparent that he's not doing well here. Episode 2, 0 confessionals, not particularly great there. And while we see him recognizing that he has a target on his back and that he is on the out, we also see him trying to build game relationships with people like Ron, for instance, only to be undermined there, where Ron is talking about how he tricked Joe into thinking that he's with them, only to have like people looking through Joe's bag, and really he was in a pretty bad spot there. Now in episode 5, he does get to respond to the Aubrey boot, where he does get pretty emotional about seeing Aubrey go and how he is in this bad position, which does cause him to move up slightly, though again, not really enough to make him a contender. And then in his boot episode, the merge episode, he gets 0 confessionals, which is really insane there. The fact that he gets no confessionals in his boot episode, despite him being this pretty notable figure in Survivor history. So again, Joe is someone who I never really saw as much of a contender there. And on the edge, he never really did it for me either. Never really saw him as much of a contender even there. So again, makes sense why he didn't win. Next up is Eric, who is actually the first person here who I did consider a contender, at least at one point, where he actually had a pretty solid start to the season, getting a decent premiere, talking about how he's a firefighter and that he's used to helping people. He also builds his relationship with Gavin there. That seems like an important relationship as well, to where he and Gavin are the top 2 after the premiere, and he even moves up to number 1 after episode 2. Mind you, he only gets 1 confessional in episode 2, but still, he does get 0 confessionals in episode 3, but still remains at number 1, mainly because of how screwy the edit here is, and considering how he didn't really do anything to detract him, while no one else seemed to really do anything to surpass him. And it's not until episode 4 where, again, he doesn't really get too complex content there, most of it being about the chicken situation, that does cause him to slide a bit. And he does continue to slide each episode afterwards, where it becomes more apparent that his edit just isn't rising to the occasion here. Again, episode 5 isn't really anything special. A lot of it's about like the actual vote and taking out Wendy, where I think the biggest knock there is him talking about how he's willing to go to rocks, and that as a big fan, he imagines himself in a situation only to not go to rocks and take out Wendy instead. I think that's not a particularly good look there. And then we get to his merge, where, again, it's just kind of whatever. He does solidify the Comma Alliance. Mind you, he doesn't get much input there in terms of confessional count, but he is showing the game talks there to take out Joe. And then we get to his boot episode, where out of nowhere, he and Ron are presented as this dynamic duo that's been running the game, which kind of goes against what we've been seeing on the show, where it felt like in the pre-merge he was focusing more so on his relationship with Gavin, but suddenly he and Ron are these big threats that need to be taken out, and he is the one taken out at that next tribal. So again, it's a pretty strange edit here, where he does start off strong, but then kind of goes downhill as it goes along. And then on the edge, he actually gets pretty good content on the edge, where I did think for a couple of episodes that he was one of the more likely edge returnees after the merge. But I feel like by the end of it, he does kind of die off as well. So again, a very strange edit, but at least he was a contender at one point. Next up, we have Julia, and Julia was not a contender. She actually doesn't get a single confessional until episode 5, which is really insane, where she's one of only 6 people in Survivor history to not get a single confessional until episode 5, which is ridiculous. She's one of only 2 people to not get a confessional in the premiere, the other being someone we'll be talking about later. And again, it's pretty bizarre seeing how quiet she is early on to where she is consistently pretty low on the power rankings there. Now, our first confessional in episode 5 is talking about how she wants Joe gone and how Joe's a pretty big threat, though at the same time, she talks about the need to adapt. At the merge episode, her only confessional is about sticking calm and strong, which kind of goes against what she said in the previous episode, which is pretty weird. And at the same time, she does end up voting out Joe, which kind of goes against that. Her big breakout episode is in episode 7, where she does get a decent amount of content there, where she seems to be a big decision maker in the eventual Eric blindside, and she does go through with that, which is good, but again, it's a bit too little too late. And then we get to her boot episode where, again, she gets a decent amount of content as well, though actually her boot isn't really set up that well, where, again, a lot of it just kind of comes together at Tribal at the last moment. So that's something at least. And then on the Edge, I didn't really see her as much of a contender until like the final episode before the finale, to where I did think there was at least a little bit of a shot she could get back in, but obviously she doesn't. So again, Julia is actually one of the most under-edited characters on this season, and the fact that she doesn't get her first confessional until episode 5 is pretty alarming at the end of the day, but obviously it made her not really a contender. Next up, we have David Wright, and he was pretty hard to assess edit-wise for a lot of the season, where yes, he is one of the more consistent presences, at least for the most part, but at the same time, it was really hard to gauge whether he was truly a contender, considering he was one of the returning players. Now, right off the bat, he gets a pretty solid premiere, nothing too crazy, but he does get to talk about how, he has kind of stepped into his own and how he's more confident now compared to the first time he played, and all that's fine. But then we get to episode 2, where he is one of the people trying to blindside Kelly Wentworth, only to not get his way there, and he does actively vote to take out Keith, which isn't a particularly great look. And then we get to episode 3, where he once again tries to target Kelly Wentworth, and while he does technically fail in the sense that he does vote out Chris, he does at least explain the Chris vote, saying how by voting out Chris, it means that no one knows that he's targeting Kelly Wentworth, which I thought was good enough to him to go back up to number 5. He does get blindsided at the swap episode, but I feel like that wasn't enough to really demerit him, considering he is shown to be in a pretty bad game spot, and it made sense why he voted the way that he did, sticking by Rick Devens there. Though I will say the next 2 episodes are pretty strange, considering it does seem like he's getting a bit of a journey arc here, where in episode 5 he talks about how he's 44 and all he has is a 2-bedroom apartment and DVDs on a shelf, which kind of goes against what he said in the premiere about how he was more confident now. Now it seems like he is trying to become more confident by getting the idol, only to not get the idol, which I don't think is a particularly good look there. And then he gets 0 confessionals in the merge episode, which is not a particularly good sign, if you ask me. But then we get to episode 7, where I did debate whether he should have gone back up, as on paper, it's not a particularly good look that he is trying to get Rick Devens on his side, to side with the Lessus, only for Rick to not do so. But I do feel like David is shown being on the right by the end of that, where they do get their way in taking out Eric, while Rick seems to be pretty irrational by not trusting the Lessus at that point. Episode 8, we do see him being in a good game spot, and he is talking a bit about his survivor sense, his spidey sense, which I believe he also mentioned earlier in the season, but that gets reinforced there. And then we get to his boot episode, where he is shown to be the clear boot there. And then he gets to the Edge, where while his content on the Edge isn't terrible for a lot of it, I feel like by the time of the finale, I was pretty low on his chances of getting back into the game, considering he's not one of the people that gets a confessional explaining his letter. He's more so just reading it verbatim. So at the end of the day, I'm not seeing David as a particularly likely winner coming back into the game, but I feel like even before that, I feel like his edit was pretty confusing in my eyes, where there were points where I really wanted to put him lower on the list, but I feel like with the rest of the field being pretty inconsistent and going up and down all the time, it kind of forced David to remain in contention for me, even though I had plenty of doubts regarding it. Next up, we have Kelly Wentworth, who is another very confusing player to assess here. Again, another player that I didn't really know what to do with, considering she was a returning player, and naturally she was one of the more consistent presences on the show, but I was never fully on board with having her as a top contender for most of it, as I always felt like she had this massive target on her back, and a lot of her content was there because she was this returning player and someone who you would expect to be getting a lot of content. Now, right off the bat, she has a solid premiere talking about how she wants to change up how she plays this time, how she was on the bottom last time, and how this time she wants to build genuine relationships. And we do see her doing so. We do see her talking to Lauren early on, but at the same time, we also see her being targeted, considering that she is Kelly Wentworth. But still, she's able to get through this first tribal unscathed. I did drop her after the next couple of episodes, as even though she was getting her way, where despite her being targeted, she was surviving all these votes. I just had this feeling that she was being overexposed on the show and that she was someone who would very clearly be taken out at some point, considering how early she is being targeted. And again, I am a bit surprised that she does end up surviving all these rounds. And with her edit continuing to be one of the more consistent ones, I did gradually go higher on her, where by the time of the merge, I did have her number 2 coming into the merge, as I felt like a lot of the other top contenders were kind of dropping off, where I feel like Wentworth was having one of the more consistent edits there, and she was shown getting her way at multiple points. And she also gets plenty of strategic content along the way to where we understand her point of view from a game standpoint. Now, I will say that by the time of the merge, I was having my doubts where she did seem to be getting more of this journey arc where there's a storyline about her eventually entering the majority after the merge and how she's never been in this power position before, how she spent her entire career on the bottom, which did feel like it was setting up towards a downfall. But again, considering how wonky this season's editing was, I was kind of forced to put her at number 1 despite that, coming into her boot episode even. But obviously she is eventually taken out with an idol in her pocket at the final 9, though she is technically 10th place by the end of it. And on the edge, I feel like she never really did much there, to where she was a pretty bottom contender for a lot of that her time there, didn't really get much content. So again, not too surprised she didn't come back into the game afterwards. But again, she was one of the more confusing edits for me, where despite her having this consistent presence and her consistently getting game talk, it always felt like it was eventually leading up to a downfall at some point. It is largely the fact that other people were more inconsistent with their edits that kind of propped her up in the power rankings. Next up, we have War Dog, and War Dog was definitely one of the hardest people to evaluate as well, considering his edit was all over the place tonally, where early on he actually has a pretty solid start. He was a contender after the premiere. He gets the first confessional of the season talking about how he is his New Yorker and military guy, but he's also going to law school and that he doesn't want people to know that. And we do see him like being part of the initial majority early on. He gets plenty to do across those early episodes that makes him a top contender and one of the more consistent presences there. He also gets credit for the Chris blindside in episode 3. And while there's this concern about him being overexposed, I had that same concern with Kelly Wentworth. And considering he wasn't being as targeted early on compared to Wentworth, I felt like it's a bit more warranted to have him higher, to where I actually had him at number 1 after episode 4. But then in episode 5, his edge just suddenly turns really negative, where we hear people at camp talking about how he's domineering, how all he does is crunch numbers while he doesn't do anything at camp and he sucks at challenges. Again, very sudden shift negatively. And while he does get his way, I did have to drop him at that point. He's also invisible in the merge episode that also caused him to drop, but then he turns back positive, where we do see him afterwards being a pretty integral figure in the eventual Eric blindside. He does have a quiet episode 8 where his only confessional comes in the beginning after Tribal, how he wants to just sit back and blow the game open. But then he does jump back up the following episode where he does get credit for the eventual Wentworth blindside. So again, he does get some positivity there, but then we get to his Wood episode where it's right back down to being negative. And in general, War Dog's edit is very strange, where it feels like that for all the positives that we get, where for all the stuff that we get from his perspective game-wise and character-wise, we also get plenty of people talking about how he's domineering and that he's like just crunching numbers. And again, a lot of it just feels like it comes out of nowhere. It feels like there's no consistency in whether we're supposed to be rooting for this guy or supposed to be rooting against him. And by the end, it's just a big mess. But again, the editing as a whole this season is a mess, to where it never felt like he was truly out of contention. Though by the time he goes to the edge, I didn't see him as a likely returnee, so that largely checks out there. But again, I do find War Dog a pretty confusing figure on the season. Next up, we have Ron Clark, who, despite being one of the bigger characters on the season, is also kind of whatever in terms of his edit, and he actually has a pretty slow start. Now, in the premiere, he does get to introduce himself as a teacher, but the bulk of his content comes when he is finding out about his advantage menu, which obviously doesn't play much of a factor on the season, at least for him at least, but outside of that, a lot of that felt pretty circumstantial, and he gets pretty quiet content in the next couple of episodes. He does get a camp scene in episode 2, like where he's coming up with his chant for the tribe, but no confessionals there, no confessionals in episode 3 either. It's not until episode 4 that he gets more of a visibility spike, where we see him like trying to trick Joe into thinking that he's working with him, only to have the likes of Julia searching through his bag, which definitely has a bit of a villainous tinge to it, but it still was interesting the way that scene was portrayed. We think it's episode 5 where he once again talks about Joe being this big threat that needs to be taken out soon. And then we get to episode 6, the merge episode, where he is the one that takes out Joe there. So again, all that's pretty good. He does get up to number 4, but then he kind of goes right back down really the rest of the season, where in episode 7 he is blindsided when Eric goes home. He and Eric were presented as this dynamic duo, which wasn't really showcased on the show, as again Eric was more so shown to be working with Gavin, and it really felt like that duo was being set up here to set up the eventual blindside of Eric, which obviously leaves Ron on the bottom. And I don't think he really does much in episode 8 to really cause him to go back up, though he does recover slightly in the next couple of episodes where he does become more of a consistent presence there. We do see him working alongside the likes of War Dog to blindside the likes of David and Kelly Wentworth. We have him later being responsible for the War Dog blindside in the following episode, being shown as a swing vote there. Though I think his boot episode very clearly sets up his downfall, where we see him trying to trick Rick by giving him the expired advantage menu. We have him trying to blindside Rick, only for him to be shown as this pretty big threat. We see the likes of Gavin and Victoria agreeing to like split the vote onto Ron, and sure enough, he does eventually go out after Rick pretty much puts him on blast for trying to trick him in the middle of tribal council. So again, his downfall here is pretty expected. And I think for the most part, Ron's edit is pretty inconsistent, where I never really saw him as that big of a contender outside of the merge episode, but I still find him to be a pretty fun character, definitely one of the bigger characters of the season, but someone who never really felt like he had much of a shot based off the way he was portrayed, where it felt like things would just pop in and out of relevance for him by the end of it, but he was still a pretty fun character nonetheless. Next up, we have Aurora, and as you'd expect, Aurora was never really a contender, though I will say the beginning of her season wasn't terrible, where in the premiere, her main content is her talking about how it's nice having Joe in their tribe and that she wants to work with him. And then in episode 2, she does get a pretty generic content about how morale on the Kama tribe is pretty good. But despite her being this very blatant person on the bottom, she never really gets much to do during the pre-merge, and she has a pretty bad dry spell where from episodes 3 through 6, she gets 0 confessionals in that entire stretch, which is pretty bad and really kicks her towards the bottom of the list. Where her next confessional comes in episode 7, which is right after the Joe blindside, where she talks about how she was blindsided and how she was one of the only commas left in the dark there, and how she has to work her way out the bottom. Though at the same time, she gets some pretty circumstantial content in this episode, like her winning immunity and then getting the extra vote from the Edge. She then gets 0 confessionals during the Julia round, where really her only content comes at Tribal, where she is the one to cause things to blow up. But we then get to episode 9, where she does get to react to this, how she pretty much ruined her game here. And while she does get plenty of content in episode 9, this is also a round where she ends up giving the extra vote to Ron, where she gets to explain how it's designed to build trust. But then we have her almost getting blindsided during the Wentworth round, but is able to scrape through that. You then have episode 10, where her main content is her getting mad at Ron and them having this fight, but despite that, they still work together and taking out War Dog. Episode 11, she does get content, though at the same time it's because she has to, considering she is the one to give the extra vote to Gavin to pull off the eventual Ron blindside. And then you have her boot episode in episode 12, where, again, it's pretty bad, where she gets this whole storyline about how she finally has this alliance within the game, only for her to feel on the outs of that, considering she isn't brought on the reward, and she does like grapple with that, only to eventually be taken out after Rick wins immunity. So for the most part, it's a pretty bad edit, where despite her being someone who could have been this underdog figure on the season, considering how much she was on the bottom, it really felt like the show was only showing her when it was absolutely necessary, and by the end, I felt like her boot episode was pretty well foretold, to where it made sense why she was eventually taken out, and really, she was never really a contender by the end of it. Next up, we have Victoria, who wasn't bad on the show edit-wise, but was rarely a contender in my eyes. Now, right off the bat, she does get a good enough premiere. I mean, she talks about how she's a big fan and how she's been wanting to play for years, but really her premiere is mostly quiet. Episode 2, we do get a bit more where she talks about like wanting to target Aubrey due to Aubrey not really playing the best here. That causes her to go up slightly in this ranking. Episode 3 is more the same, where she talks more about being in the majority alliance and them wanting to target the returnees first, but really doesn't really pop up the screen there. Now, I think she does go up a bit in episode 5, where that's the point where she does target Aubrey, and she's the one that is able to convince Aubrey that there's this women's alliance coming together, all to make Aubrey feel complacent, to the point where she gets taken out with the idol and extra vote in her pocket, which I felt was pretty good content for Victoria and definitely moved her up into contention. But then she goes right back down at the merge episode, where she does end up voting out Joe, despite her talking confessional about taking the safe route and targeting Wentworth instead. Again, she kind of contradicts herself, goes back down there. Zero confessionals in episode 7, the Eric blindside. Despite her being a big part of that, she has no input in that eventual vote. And she's kind of under the radar the next couple of episodes, where while she isn't necessarily being undermined, where she is technically voting correctly there, I feel like it's not until episode 11 that she gets more of a visibility spike, where at that point we see her getting pretty upset over the loved one's visit and her eventually having a part in the Ron blindside, where obviously she has a big part in that. Episode 12, she does get more to do there, but by that point, she's not really much of a contender, where I think you could argue that she was a contender, at least at one point, particularly right before the merge, but I feel like her edit never really took off the same way that you would expect, where even though she is getting a somewhat consistent presence on the show, it never really felt like it was leading to a season-long storyline, and I feel like the fact that she doesn't pop off more in the post-merge, where I feel like she's just pretty under the radar for most of the season, made it so that she was never truly a contender by the end of it, though at the same time she was a pretty big threat to win. Next up, we have Lauren O'Connell, and the weird thing about Lauren is, even though she got content during the season that probably would not make her a contender on most seasons, I feel like on this season, considering how everyone kept going up and down, it kind of propped her up to a degree, as I felt like her edit wasn't as bad compared to a lot of other people, even though there are still some massive holes within it. Now in the premiere, her main content is her propping up the returnees, talking about how Wentworth and Joe Angam are her favorite players, but beyond that, her premiere isn't too flashy. Episode 2, her main content is her finding the idol, and while I would chalk this up to circumstantial content, she also gets to set up the storyline about her following in the footsteps of her favorite female players, so being Parvati and Wentworth, and how like she could eventually use that to play the idol effectively. So again, that was decent. Episode 3 is pretty invisible, but not really enough to detract her, considering that this season is just pretty weird on the whole. Now, I think her post-swap is pretty strange, where I do feel like she kind of gets some basic content talking about how hungry she is, and I feel like on most situations, I would consider this to not be the best content in the world, though she actually is number 2 after episode 4, which I think is a pretty weird quirk of these rankings, and she's not doing too bad during the rest of the pre-merge, though she is pretty invisible in the merge episode, getting 0 confessionals there, which I did knock her a bit for, though not as much as I probably would have on other seasons. Though with that said, I think her early merge is pretty lackluster, where episode 7, her main content is about her being hungry once again and being deprived of the elements, which is not particularly great. Episode 8 is pretty invisible, no confessionals there. Episode 9, her main content is her talking about the 6-person alliance that doesn't really hold by the end of it, and while she becomes a bit more prominent later on the season, where in episode 10, she is seen as a swing vote during the War Dog blindside. In episode 11, she's shown being part of the original Rom blindside. I feel like by that point in the season, I was very much conflicted on her, where considering how quiet a lot of her post-merge had been, I didn't really feel like she was going to win by the end of it, and I felt like I was more so higher on other people, though obviously we see her game falling apart during the finale, where she plays her idol on Chris for no reason, and then she's taken out the next round, so on the whole, it kind of falls apart by the end of it, though even before that, despite her having a pretty lackluster edit, I did actually have her pretty high for a lot of it. Next up, we have Rick Devens, the final juror of the season, and while he's known now for being the screen hog and someone who has a massive edit, he doesn't really blow up in the edit until the end of it. Now, early on, he does have a pretty good premiere, talking about how he's a news anchor, he's a big fan, he has a dad bod, and he believes in himself. Again, pretty good stuff there, pretty high early on. And early on, he does have a pretty consistent edit leading up to his first boot. And I feel like had this been a normal season with no Edge of Extinction, I'm pretty sure this would have come off as a pretty big blindside when he is eventually taken out in episode 4, considering how consistent of a presence he's been and considering how he mostly got a positive edit. And while he only spends one episode at the Edge before coming back to the game, I will say that his episode on the Edge wasn't the greatest in the world. He does get a pretty big edit there, though obviously he's shown being wrong in terms of finding the advantage there, and I would say that it was largely between him and Chris in terms of who was going to come back into the game at that point, though obviously he's the one that comes back at the merge. Now, the merge episode where he comes back is pretty good for the most part, though at the same time, a lot of it can feel circumstantial considering he is the one that comes back to the game, and you want to have hope that this person will do well after coming back. Though he does kind of go downhill in episode 7, where that's the episode where he openly tells War Dog and the Lessus that he doesn't want to work with them, and we see him having a bit of a rift there with David, only to be wrong, where he ends up siding on the wrong side of the vote, which is a pretty bad look, though, considering how wonky the editing of the season is. It wasn't enough to fully detract him there. And we do see him rebound in the following episode where him being on the wrong side of the vote actually allows him to rebuild trust with the likes of Ron and Julie. And we do later get the whole pilots and passengers speech in the middle of Tribal that obviously propels him into top contention there. And he does spend the next 2 episodes, episodes 9 and 10, at the number 1 spot. He is the front runner at that point, though it's obviously a weird situation where, considering how big of a character he is and how much of an underdog he seems to be, I did start to question whether this would actually lead to a win or not, or if it would be cut later down the line, and really how much of this run is legitimate. And episode 11 is where he does blow up in the edit, getting a ton of confessionals there, by that point being the main character of the season. Though ironically, that's actually what bumps him down to number 2 for the rest of the season, as it makes me think that he's going to come up just short by the end of it, considering he is this very obvious person, very obvious frontrunner, and considering how unpredictable the entire season had been up to this point, it made me question whether they would actually take this approach, or if it was just like the parting of the clouds at the end of a long train wreck. But obviously he does come up short by the end of it. So I do find Rick's edit this season to be pretty interesting, where in a lot of ways he was towards the front of the pack for a lot of the season. He was one of the more consistent presences on the show, especially when he was in the game. And in a lot of ways, you could say that he was hiding in plain sight, where he was just hiding in the background the whole time for him to eventually come out and win. Though considering just how disproportionately big his edit becomes by the end of it and how much of a fan favorite he seems to be, it just made sense for him to be cut just before the end. Next up, we had the runners-up, starting up with Julie Rosenberg. And you'd think Julie would be pretty under-edited, but she's actually one of the bigger characters on the season and someone who does end up getting a decent amount of character-based content on the show, to where she has a pretty solid premiere, getting to talk about how she's from New York and has no survival skills, and we even get this whole inspirational scene of her chopping bamboo at camp, which is pretty funny, but still, it was enough to have her pretty high early on. But episode 2 is pretty wonky, where she ends up having this whole discussion about how men always find idols, kind of similar to Angelina, and how the women should be idol hunting as well, only for a woman to not find the idol in this episode, which is pretty weird. Episode 3 is pretty invisible, again, not particularly great, though she actually moves up despite her getting 0 confessionals, which I do find pretty interesting there. Episode 4, her only content comes during the swap, where she talks about how the swap is unpredictable and how the game is out of her control, but really nothing too special beyond that. But then episode 5, she really pops off, where she gets a ton of content there, which obviously leads into her wanting to target the vets coming into the merge, to where she was actually the front runner coming into the merge, which is pretty interesting in hindsight there. And I even have her at number 1 after the merge episode, though I will say that she doesn't get her way there, where she does talk about wanting to target Wentworth, which kind of goes against her content from the previous episode, talking about how she wanted to target Joe. And while she does eventually go through and targeting Joe and voting him out, I still found that pretty strange, but for some reason I still felt like it was good enough to have her here at number 1. But then after that, she kind of goes downhill afterwards. Episode 7, she ends up getting no content there despite her being blindsided. Though at the same time, you could say that this was her being shielded from a bad game outcome. And we see her having a bounce back in episode 8, talking about how she was upset about being blindsided there. And she even gets emotional about it, how she's counting the days till she can see her family again, and that she has nowhere to support and she's on the bottom, which isn't great content, but she is able to rebound nonetheless and is able to remain around the midpoint in the list. Episode 9 is a bit better, where the first half of it, she is shown being the swing vote during the David blindside, and then the following round, she's out of the loop during the Wentworth blindside, where she does want to target Aurora there, though again, she does be consistent with what she plans to do, so she is genuinely blindsided from a game standpoint. Episode 10, she once again talks about being on the bottom and how she wants to move through the game. Now, at the same time, she does want to target Aurora for a lot of it, only for her to eventually take out War Dog instead, which is not a particularly good look. And then from that point on, I think it becomes pretty clear that she's largely being dragged to the game as a GOAT. And I feel like at that point, she doesn't really have much win equity from a game standpoint, which does cause her to drop relatively low compared to the people still in the game. So it is an interesting edit for the most part. There are actually points where she was in contention there, but other points where she is out of the loop. And despite her being someone who you would think could be this pretty under the radar person, she actually gets a pretty sizable edit for someone like her, which I do find pretty interesting. Next up, we have Gavin, who despite having pretty clear holes in his edit, is actually a top contender for pretty much the entire season, even though I felt incredibly uneasy about it. Now, it gets a pretty good premiere where he does get to establish his relationship with Eric. He talks about being a fan and from the South, and that he's not just a good old Southern boy, but he knows the show, and that he's here to win the title Sole Survivor. Again, getting a winner quote there is pretty good. And again, I feel like he gets a pretty strong start to the season, but then he goes quiet for 2 episodes in a row, getting 0 confessionals in episodes 3 and 4, which is really strange, especially considering him getting no confessionals in the swap episode. I think that's pretty bad. Though I feel like the strength of his first 2 episodes is largely what carries him during that dry spell. Now I think his episode 5 is pretty funny as he talks about crapping bricks over going to rocks, and that he's willing to go to rocks for his tribe, but then he just votes out Wendy on the revote, which I don't think is a particularly good look, but again, with the way the season is, I felt like I couldn't be too picky there. He does get a good enough merge episode, not too prominent, but he is shown being part of the eventual Joe plan. But then we get to the following episode, which is just really bizarre as, again, he was established earlier in the season as having this bond with Eric, but then the show just completely forgets about that and instead focuses on this dynamic duo between Ron and Eric. And Gavin doesn't really get much explanation for why he eventually votes out Eric, despite him seeming to be close to him early on, as it feels like his only content there is him talking about how like he wants to play for his family and how Ron's promise of getting the commas to the family visit is something that he resonates with, which again doesn't make sense considering he later votes out Eric. So I did find that a bit strange, even though he actually ends up being number 1 because that's the season for you. But however, he does get to explain at the beginning of the next episode, talking about how he wants a resume and that Eric was keeping him behind the curtain. But then later in that same episode, we see him wanting to target David, only for all of his allies to not want to target David, instead go for Wentworth, which gives him this confessional about how it's a dictatorship over here. And then we get to the following episode where he eventually does get his way in taking out David, but again, the fact that he previously got that content about not having agency on his tribe was pretty funny. But then from that point on, he's actually in the top 2 the rest of the way, where, again, I feel like if this were a normal season of the show, I would have significant issues with Gavin's edit to where he would be significantly lower and not be in the top 2. But I feel like with everyone else having bigger holes in their edit, that kind of leaves Gavin here as a bit of a front runner, and he actually overtakes Rick Devens in the final 2 episodes of the season, as I felt like with Rick having such an obvious presence on the show, it made me think that if Rick got taken out before the end, that Gavin would be the next most likely winner, as it seemed like he had the least holes in his edit, even though there were still plenty of holes to be there. So it's sort of the epitome of this season as a whole, where I was just so unsure about everyone for so much of the season, where everyone just had so many inconsistencies with their edit, plenty of dry spells, plenty of negativity, and just bouncing all over the place tonally, that it kind of made Gavin the frontrunner, even though he still had significant issues in his edit. So we're coming to the finale, I did peg him as the winner, though obviously that didn't quite work out. And finally, we do have the actual winner of the season in Chris Underwood. And Chris got a very abnormal winner edit for obvious reasons, and I think his win very much explains in hindsight why everyone else's edits were so strange. Though at the same time, Chris's edit was also very bizarre, where even before his vote out in episode 3, he was getting a very lackluster edit, where in the premiere, he's one of only 2 people in the premiere to get 0 confessionals, with Julia being the other person. And again, the fact that he's one of only a few winners in Survivor history to get 0 confessionals in the premiere is very strange. I instantly wrote him off as a contender at that point, and he was actually below Julia as he got 0 confessionals despite going to tribal in that episode. And then in episode 2, we do have him trying to save Keith initially, but then that just completely backfires. He doesn't get his way there, has to vote out Keith instead. And then in episode 3, we do see him trying to flip the game onto Wentworth, only for that plan to blow up and for him to be voted out there. Now, I will say that his first episode on the Edge is pretty profound, where he does get to set up his storyline about how he wanted to play a perfect game, but now that's completely in the trash. And he does get pretty decent content there initially. Now, I should also mention this pretty random scene that happens in this episode at the Manu camp before the swap, where Rick tells David that he's pretty good at making fire, only for David to respond by saying that he's not as good as it as Chris. And this line is literally subtitled. Now, I'm not going to pretend at all that I would have factored this into the power ranking at the time, but I thought I should mention that they did have some foreshadowing for down the road. But obviously, we do have Chris being one of the more likely people to return from the Edge, at least from an edit standpoint, only for him to not do so. And then during the merge, he's actually pretty quiet during a lot of those episodes. While we do have one scene of him catching some fish and having other people talking about it, he's pretty quiet during a lot of that stretch, which obviously did cause him to drop a bit. There was actually a point where I thought Aubrey was more likely to come back after the merge compared to him, though I think the final episode before the finale really solidified that he was the most likely to come back, as he got to come full circle with his story arc about wanting to play a perfect game, and he gets to make a big meal out of the letter that he wrote before the season, and I felt like he got more content there compared to other people reading their letters, to where it made sense that he would come back into the game. Now, I didn't expect him to actually win after getting back into the game, to where that felt more like a surprise than anything else. But again, I feel like the edit was there to explain why he eventually comes back into the game, and there is some minor foreshadowing that eventually leads to him beating Rick and Fire, though obviously that felt so minor and so unlikely with him being on the Edge that it just didn't feel like a practicality. But obviously, considering that he does end up winning the season, it does explain why a lot of the other players had such bizarre edits, as they were obviously not the winners. But I was not going into the season expecting the Edge player to actually win the game by the end of it, to where Chris felt like a very unexpected winner. And there we go, that'll do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, really helps with the channel. Now, I will also be doing a player ranking for this season, which I guarantee you will be just as train wrecky as this power ranking was, but stay tuned for that. I'm on Patreon, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description, and you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.